Hi, and welcome to American Education, Draw My Life Edition. Let's jump right into it, shall we? So at the beginning of the 17th century, England began colonizing the New World. For the Puritans who were settling the new colonies, the chief goal of education was to inculcate religious piety in their children. The Old Deluder Satan Law, enacted in Massachusetts in 1647, required communities to hire a teacher or establish a grammar school to educate their children in reading and writing, quote, it being the chief project of the Old Deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures. Now let's talk about Native Americans. Something the colonists quickly set about doing was attempting to convert their indigenous neighbors to Protestant Christianity. Except they did it wrong in pretty much every way possible. They were like, bow to Jesus! And the Indians were like, no. And the colonists were like, well, we'll have to kill you then! For the English colonists, the lines are pretty blurred between trying to convert the natives and trying to swindle them out of their land too. Whether the intention was to convert the Indians, deculturalize them, win their allegiance against the French, or, and I think this is right, all the above, education was a powerful tool, and the practice arose of taking native children to boarding schools away from their tribe to attempt to reform them from an early age. In 1783, the Revolutionary War ended, and as people dusted themselves off, the ex-lawyer turned educator Noah Webster seized the reins of the minds of America's youth. Equipped with his 3-volume Grammatical Institute of the English Language, Webster set about forging a moral, patriotic populace and a bright future for every person who is white, Protestant, and Anglo-Saxon. In the early 19th century, charity schools and juvenile reformatories were developed with the goal of keeping poor kids off the streets and morally reforming them by replacing their flawed family life with a strict school structure. The Lancastrian system, characterized by its factory-like approach to teaching, became popular in America around this time because of its inexpensiveness and efficiency in teaching large numbers of students. In 1834, the educational reformer and patron saint of the Common School movement, Horace Mann, was nominated to the Massachusetts State Board of Education. Mann believed that, with proper moral and political instruction, and by mixing different social classes in common schools, a society without crime or poverty would arise, and police and jails would be replaced by teachers and schools. He ran into a lot of difficulty, however, finding common ground between people of different religious creeds and socioeconomic classes, to say the least. As we continued our long tradition of treating religious and racial minorities like minority groups faced deculturalization and discrimination in state schools. Freed African Americans attempting to send their children to school faced outright hostility from whites in the school system. In 1809, Sequoyah began working on an alphabet by which Cherokee people would be able to read and write in their own language. After their devastating relocation to the Western Territories, Choctaws and Cherokees were able to establish successful tribal school systems. In the mid to late 19th century, Catholics began to establish independent Catholic schools paid for by church funds in order to educate their children in an environment more friendly towards their faith. American education in the late 19th century underwent some changes, such as taking a more clear-cut hierarchical ladder of authority, going from superintendents to principals to assistant principals down to teachers, etc. Graded schools, such as the Quincy School, also began to emerge based on the Prussian model, in which students were organized by age into smaller rooms where they were taught by a teacher at their own desk. The early 20th century also saw a resurgence of activism for black education equality. W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington took different stances on that path towards racial equality. Washington said that the way forward for the African American community was to emphasize industrial education to bring African Americans into a position of such economic viability and importance that they would gain equal education and rights. Du Bois, on the other hand, argued that a well-educated generation of African Americans must be brought up to secure their rights for future generations. In 1909, Du Bois would help found and lead the NAACP. In 1896, John Dewey began his laboratory school at University of Chicago with the goal of developing a method of teaching which would foster what he called social imagination in his students and teach them to cooperatively solve material problems encountered in the real world. Going into the 20th century, high schools started increasingly to reflect the economic needs of industrial America. High schools, like the industrial workplace, began to focus on specialization by teaching students for certain occupations through vocational training. Equality of opportunity changed from meaning every child should get the same curriculum, as the Common School movement believed, to meaning that every child should be given an individualized education to help them achieve their fullest potential. In 1923, Carl Brigham published a study of American intelligence in which he measured the intelligence of different ethnic groups using the alpha-beta tests, which had been developed and used by the military during World War I. His concern he expressed at the end of the study was that intelligence in America would decline if ethnic interbreeding continued. The National Education Association spiked in membership from 1917 to 1920. In 1917, they also moved headquarters to Washington, D.C., forging stronger ties with the federal government. Unfortunately, as the NEA was for the most part run by groups of administrators, teachers' issues are pretty much in the back seat until the 1970s. In 1963, President Kennedy launched what he called the War on Poverty, setting initiatives to counteract structures which perpetuated the cycle of poverty. In 1964 and 65, Congress passed the Economic Opportunity Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Title I would carry over into the 21st century under No Child Left Behind in 2001. In 1983, a report, A Nation at Risk, spurred a change in educational policy to focus on improving America's global economic competitive edge. The Obama administration's Race to the Top explicitly expressed the concern that American communities should be prepared to compete in a global economy and tied educational policy directly to the needs of global corporations. All through the late 20th century to today, programs for education on environmental issues have been tragically underfunded at the state and federal level. Educators and environmental activists, such as Chet Bowers and David Orr, have criticized the corporate industrial paradigm of education for neglecting true human well-being and measuring wealth in terms of consumption, rather than preparing children for changes that will need to be made in the economy in the future if we are to preserve a planet for all of us to live upon.